The thunderous sound of galloping horses shattered the dawn's stillness, rousing Florence Reed from her fitful slumber. She bolted upright, her heart pounding against her ribs as dust filtered through the floorboards of her modest homestead. The riders were coming again, and this time she feared they wouldn't leave empty-handed. Florence pushed aside the thin cotton blanket and rushed to the window, her honey-colored hair falling loose around her shoulders. Through the partially frosted glass of her bedroom window, she counted 6 riders approaching her property. The red bandanas covering the lower halves of their faces told her everything she needed to know. The Blackwater Gang had returned, just as they'd promised. It was 1876, 3 years after her father had staked his claim on this patch of Wyoming Territory. 3 years of backbreaking work to transform wilderness into a functioning cattle ranch. 3 months since her father's passing had left her alone to fend for herself. And now, just 1 week since Wade Blackwater had offered to buy her land for a pittance, threatening consequences if she refused, Florence grabbed her father's shotgun from beside the bed. She'd never fired it at a person, but the weight of the weapon gave her a sense of security, however false it might be. The men were drawing closer, their horses kicking up clouds of dust in the early morning light. "You had your chance, Miss Reed," a gruff voice called out. "Time to negotiate a different arrangement." Florence's hands trembled as she loaded the shotgun. She knew what they wanted. Her father's land sat atop an underground spring, the only reliable water source for miles during the dry season. Whoever controlled this land controlled the fate of every ranch and farm in the valley. "I am not selling," she shouted through the closed window, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is my home." The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, pulled his horse to a stop 30 yards from her front porch. "Not asking to buy anymore, Miss Reed. We're taking. Your choice is whether you come willing or unwilling." Florence felt her blood run cold. She had heard stories of ranchers who refused to sell being found dead days later, their deaths ruled accidents or attributed to Indian raids. But she had never imagined they would try to take her. "I have the deed," she called out, desperately trying to reason with unreasonable men. "The law is on my side," the leader laughed, the sound ugly and threatening. "Law's 3 days' ride from here, Miss Reed, and we're right outside your door." The sound of splintering wood from the back of the house told Florence they were already breaking in. She backed away from the window, raising the shotgun as footsteps thundered through her kitchen. She was cornered, outnumbered, and terrified. Just as she prepared to face the intruders, another sound cut through the morning air, a different set of hoofbeats approaching fast from the east. Florence risked a glance out her side window and saw a lone rider galloping toward her homestead, dust billowing behind him. The rider pulled his horse to a sudden stop between Florence's house and the Blackwater Gang. Even from inside, Florence could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. A long rifle rested across his saddle, and his duster coat billowed in the morning breeze. "Morning, gentlemen," the stranger called out, his voice carrying a hint of danger beneath its calm exterior. "Seems to me the lady's made her position clear." The scarred leader turned his horse to face the newcomer. "This ain't your concern, stranger. Ride on while you still can." The stranger's horse shifted beneath him, but he held steady. "I'm making it my concern." He adjusted his position, hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "Miss Reed isn't going anywhere with you today or any day." "There's 6 of us and 1 of you," the leader snarled. "We're taking her for ransom. Her uncle in Cheyenne will pay good money to see her safe." Florence's breath caught in her throat. Her Uncle Thomas, her father's only brother and a wealthy banker in Cheyenne, was indeed well off, but she hadn't seen him in years. The stranger didn't flinch. He straightened in his saddle and said words that would change Florence's life forever. "They'll take you through me first." For a moment, time seemed suspended. Florence could see the Blackwater men exchanging glances, weighing their odds against this lone defender. The stranger sat perfectly still on his mount, but there was nothing peaceful about his stillness. It was the calm of a coiled snake ready to strike. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" demanded the leader. Name's Lucas Zimmerman, the stranger replied, pushing his hat back slightly to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind, eyes as sharp as a hawk's. I ride for the Carter Ranch to the north. Judge Carter doesn't take kindly to his neighbors being troubled. Florence recognized the name. Judge William Carter was the most powerful rancher in the territory, his spread covering thousands of acres. If this man truly worked for the judge, the Blackwater Gang might think twice. The girl has 1 minute to decide, the leader said after a tense pause. She comes with us and no one gets hurt, or we take her anyway and you die in the dirt. Lucas Zimmerman didn't move. Miss Reed stays right where she is, and you boys have 30 seconds to disappear before I put a bullet in someone. Florence clutched her shotgun tighter, prepared to defend herself if shooting started. The outlaws might kill Lucas Zimmerman, but she wouldn't be taken without a fight. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. One of the gang members, younger and more reckless than the others, reached for his pistol. Before the weapon cleared its holster, Lucas's revolver appeared in his hand as if by magic. The crack of the gunshot echoed across the valley, and the young outlaw clutched his shoulder, howling in pain as he toppled from his horse. "That's one," Lucas said calmly, his revolver still trained on the group. "Who wants to be number 2? The leader's face contorted with rage, but caution won out. "This isn't over," he spat, wheeling his horse around. "We'll be back, and your hired gun won't always be around, Miss Reed." The gang retreated, dragging their wounded companion with them. Florence watched from her window as they disappeared into the distance, her heart still racing. Only when they were out of sight did she finally lower her shotgun and step onto her front porch. Lucas Zimmerman dismounted, leading his horse closer to her house. Up close, Florence could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with keen blue eyes that missed nothing and a day's growth of beard shadowing his jaw. "Are you hurt, Miss Reed?" he asked, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy. Florence shook her head, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance in her nightdress and hastily thrown on shawl. "No, I'm unharmed. How did you know my name?" "Everyone in the valley knows Joseph Reed's place," he replied. When he passed, word spread that his daughter was running the ranch alone. He glanced in the direction the Blackwater Gang had fled. That was bound to attract trouble. "Thank you for intervening," Florence said, still clutching her shotgun, "but they'll be back, just as they said." Lucas nodded grimly. "Yes, they will. The Blackwater Gang doesn't give up easily." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you have somewhere else you can go? Family, perhaps?" "This is my home," Florence replied firmly. "My father and I built it with our own hands. I won't be driven away." A hint of admiration flickered across Lucas's face. "Brave, but perhaps unwise. Those men won't stop until they have what they want." "Then I'll have to stop them," she said, straightening her spine despite her fear. Lucas studied her for a long moment. "Judge Carter sent me to check on the neighboring ranches after hearing about Blackwater's activities. I didn't expect to find them in the middle of a kidnapping." He replaced his hat and adjusted it against the rising sun. "I'll need to report back, but I don't think you should stay here alone tonight. They might return." Florence hesitated. Pride told her to refuse help, to prove she could manage her ranch independently as she had been for the past 3 months. But practicality reminded her that 6 armed men would certainly overpower her if they returned. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Zimmerman, but I have nowhere else to go." "Then I'll stay," he said simply. "At least until we can figure out a more permanent solution." Florence opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. The alternative was facing the Blackwater Gang alone when they inevitably returned. "I'll prepare breakfast," she said instead, turning toward the door. "You must be hungry after your ride." Lucas tied his horse to the porch rail. "Much obliged, Miss Reed. And perhaps afterward you might tell me exactly what Blackwater wants with your land. Knowledge is as important as bullets when facing enemies like these." As Florence led him into her modest home, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had irrevocably changed. The Blackwater Gang wanted her land and were willing to kidnap her for ransom to get it. And now a stranger, this Lucas Zimmerman, had pledged to stand between her and danger. What she didn't know yet was that the danger was only beginning, and that the quiet cowboy who had come to her rescue would become far more important to her than she could possibly imagine. Florence busied herself at the stove, grateful for the distraction of practical tasks. The familiar rituals of cooking helped steady her trembling hands as she laid strips of bacon in the cast iron skillet. Behind her, she heard Lucas Zimmerman moving about the kitchen, his boots making the floorboards creak. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the water pump. She nodded, watching as he washed trail dust from his hands and face. In the clear morning light streaming through her kitchen window, she could better observe her unexpected defender. His features were angular but not harsh, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. His hair, revealed when he removed his hat, was the color of dark walnut and cropped short at the sides. "How long have you worked for Judge Carter?" Florence asked, needing to break the strange silence. Lucas dried his hands on a towel she offered. "Going on 5 years now, started as a regular ranch hand, worked my way up to foreman last year." "That's quite an achievement," Florence said, genuinely impressed. Judge Carter was known to be demanding but fair, promoting men based on merit rather than connections. "Judge is a good man to work for if you prove your worth," Lucas replied, sitting at her kitchen table when she indicated he should. "He's concerned about Blackwater's activities. The gang has been growing bolder, pressuring smaller ranchers to sell." Florence placed a plate before him: bacon, eggs, and the last of yesterday's biscuits. "They approached my father before he died, offering to buy our water rights. When he refused, they threatened him." She poured coffee into 2 cups. "After he passed, they waited barely a week before coming to make me the same offer." Lucas's expression darkened. "Your father was his death natural?" Florence hesitated. The question had haunted her for 3 months. "The doctor called it heart failure. He'd been having chest pains for weeks but refused to rest." She stared into her coffee. "But the timing was convenient for them." Lucas nodded grimly. "The Blackwater Gang has a reputation for making accidents happen." He took a bite of bacon, chewing thoughtfully. "Why is your land so important to them? Is it just the water?" "Partly," Florence replied. "Our spring is reliable even in the driest summers, but there's more." She hesitated, uncertain whether to trust this stranger with information her father had kept closely guarded. 2 weeks before he died, Pa found something on our north ridge." Lucas waited silently, his keen eyes encouraging her to continue. "Silver," she said quietly. "Not just traces, a proper vein running into the hillside. Pa was going to file a mineral claim after spring roundup, but—" Her voice trailed off. "But he never got the chance," Lucas finished for her. He set down his fork, his expression grave. "And you think Blackwater knows about the silver?" "Someone's been trespassing on my property at night. I've found boot prints around the north ridge." "They know, Mr. Zimmerman, and they're willing to kidnap me to force my uncle to sell." Lucas nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. "That explains their desperation. Silver could make them wealthy beyond the reach of the law." He looked at her intently. "Have you filed the mineral claim yourself?" Florence shook her head. "I haven't been able to leave the ranch unattended long enough to ride to the county seat. It's a 2-day journey each way." "And now they're watching your movements," Lucas said, thinking aloud. "If you leave to file the claim, they'll either follow you or take the ranch while you're gone." "Exactly." Florence pushed her barely touched breakfast aside. "I'm trapped, Mr. Zimmerman. They know it, and I know it." Lucas finished his coffee in a single swallow and stood, his decision apparently made. "First things first, we need to secure your property against their return, then I'll ride back to inform Judge Carter of the situation." "You believe he'll help?" Florence asked, hope and skepticism warring in her voice. "The judge has no love for the Blackwater Gang. They've been a thorn in his side for years." Lucas moved toward the window, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "More importantly, he believes in the rule of law. What they're attempting here offends everything he stands for." For the first time since waking to the sound of approaching riders, Florence felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman." "Lucas," he corrected her with a slight smile. "If I'm to be your temporary guardian, we might as well dispense with formalities." "Florence," she replied, returning his smile despite her anxiety. They spent the morning fortifying the house as best they could. Lucas helped her board up the back windows, creating firing positions that would allow them to defend against approach from any direction. He found her father's supply of ammunition and loaded every available weapon: her shotgun, her father's old Sharps rifle, and his own considerable arsenal. By midday, the house resembled a small fortress. As they worked, Florence found herself studying Lucas when he wasn't looking. There was an efficiency to his movements that spoke of military training, though he hadn't mentioned serving in the war. His hands, though calloused from ranch work, handled weapons with the familiarity of someone who had used them in more than just hunting. "You've done this before," she observed as he created a barricade near the front door. Lucas glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Army taught me a few things. 7th Cavalry, 3 years. He didn't elaborate, but Florence knew enough about the ongoing conflicts with the native tribes to understand what those 3 years might have entailed. "Is that how you ended up in Wyoming?" she asked, handing him nails from her father's toolbox. "In a roundabout way." He hammered the final board into place. "Mustered out in '72, drifted for a while, found myself in these parts when Judge Carter was looking for men who knew horses, been here since." Florence sensed there was more to his story, but she didn't press. Everyone in the West carried pasts they preferred not to discuss. Her own journey from Philadelphia after her mother's death had stories she rarely shared. By early afternoon, Lucas was preparing to ride to Judge Carter's ranch. "I should be back by nightfall," he explained as he checked his saddle. "The judge's place is only about 4 hours' ride. With any luck, I'll return with a few men." Florence nodded, trying to quell her rising anxiety at the thought of being left alone. "I'll keep watch," she promised, patting the shotgun at her side. Lucas hesitated, clearly conflicted about leaving her. "Bar the doors once I'm gone. Don't open for anyone but me." He mounted his horse, a powerful chestnut gelding. "If Blackwater's men return before I do, fire a shot in the air. I'll hear it and come running." "I'm not helpless," Florence assured him, squaring her shoulders. "My father taught me to shoot." "I don't doubt your courage," Lucas replied, genuine respect in his voice. "But those men are desperate and dangerous. Don't take unnecessary risks." As she watched him ride away, Florence felt an unexpected pang of loneliness. In the short hours since his arrival, Lucas Zimmerman's steady presence had somehow become reassuring. Now, standing alone before her fortified home, she wondered if he would indeed return, or if the Blackwater Gang would find her first. The afternoon stretched endlessly as Florence maintained her vigil. Each distant sound a bird taking flight, the wind rustling through the trees made her jump. She kept her shotgun close as she moved from window to window, watching for any sign of approaching riders. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Florence spotted movement along the creek that bordered her property. Raising her father's spyglass, she focused on the tree line and felt her blood turn to ice. 3 riders moving stealthily through the cottonwoods, their approach concealed by the natural cover. Florence recognized the scarred leader immediately. The Blackwater Gang had returned sooner than expected, and this time they were being careful. No dramatic approach across open ground, they were using the terrain to their advantage, planning to surprise her. She considered firing the warning shot Lucas had suggested, but hesitated. The sound would alert him if he was close enough to hear, but it would also tell the outlaws that she had spotted them. Better to maintain the advantage of surprise for as long as possible. Moving quietly through the house, Florence positioned herself at the window with the clearest view of the creek approach. She laid out ammunition beside her and took slow, deep breaths to steady her racing heart. Her father's words came back to her. "Aim true, breathe out as you squeeze the trigger, and never waste a shot." The outlaws had dismounted now, tethering their horses among the trees. They were approaching on foot, rifles in hand, using the tall grass for cover. Florence estimated they would reach the house in less than 10 minutes. A whisper of movement to the east caught her attention. Florence adjusted her position slightly and nearly cried out in relief. In the distance, A cloud of dust signaled riders approaching, at least 4 or 5, moving at a gallop. Lucas was returning, and he wasn't alone. The question now was timing. The Blackwater men were much closer, almost within rifle range of the house. The approaching riders were still several minutes away. Florence would need to hold off the attackers until help arrived. She aimed her shotgun through the narrow opening in the boarded window, tracking the lead outlaw as he crept forward. They hadn't spotted the approaching riders yet, too focused on the house. Florence waited until the scarred leader raised his hand, signaling his men to spread out. The blast of her shotgun shattered the evening stillness. She hadn't aimed to kill. Her shot struck the ground directly in front of the men, spraying dirt and making them dive for cover. The message was clear. She saw them, and she was armed. "That's one shell, gentlemen," she called out, quickly reloading. "The next one won't be aimed at the dirt." "You're making a mistake, Miss Reed," the leader shouted back. "We just want to talk." "Men who want to talk don't sneak up with rifles," Florence replied, her voice steadier than she felt. A shot cracked from her left, one of the outlaws firing at the window where she had appeared. Florence dropped to the floor as splinters of wood rained down. She crawled to another position, knowing she needed to keep moving to present a less predictable target. The distant thunder of approaching horses grew louder. The outlaws had heard it too. She could see them looking uncertainly toward the east, then back at the house. "Last chance, Miss Reed," the leader called. "Come out now or we burn you out." Florence fired again, this time aiming closer to where the scarred man crouched behind a water trough. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Blackwater." The sound of rifles being cocked echoed across her property as the outlaws prepared to rush the house. Florence steeled herself for their assault, knowing she couldn't possibly stop all 3 men if they came at once. But the attack never came. Instead, the air filled with hoofbeats and shouted commands as riders thundered onto her property from the east. Leading them was Lucas Zimmerman, rifle raised, with 4 armed men following close behind. "Drop your weapons," a commanding voice bellowed, not Lucas, but an older man riding beside him. Even from a distance, Florence recognized Judge William Carter, his silver hair and beard unmistakable. "You're trespassing on this lady's property." The Blackwater men found themselves caught in the open, outnumbered and outgunned. After a moment's hesitation, they lowered their weapons. "This isn't over," the scarred leader snarled, but he was addressing his words to Florence rather than his captors. "You can't hide behind Carter forever." Judge Carter dismounted, his movements spry despite his 60-odd years. "Blackwater, you're pushing my patience to its limit. I should hang you right here for attempted kidnapping." "You ain't the law, Carter," Blackwater spat. "No, but I am," said another rider, pushing back his coat to reveal a sheriff's badge. "Sheriff Tom Blake, Sweetwater County, you boys are under arrest." Florence watched from her doorway as the sheriff and Judge Carter's men disarmed the outlaws. Lucas broke away from the group and approached her, concern etched on his features. "Are you hurt?" he asked, eyes scanning for any sign of injury. Florence shook her head, suddenly exhausted as the tension drained from her body. "They never got close enough. Your timing was perfect." Lucas's shoulders relaxed visibly. "Judge Carter insisted on coming himself when I told him about the silver and the kidnapping attempt. He brought Sheriff Blake along. They were already at the ranch discussing Blackwater's activities." Florence looked past him to where the sheriff was binding the outlaws' hands. "Will they stay imprisoned this time?" Lucas's expression turned grim. "Blake is a good man, but Blackwater has friends in low places, and these 3 aren't the entire gang. So I'm still in danger," Florence concluded, the brief moment of relief evaporating. "Yes," Lucas answered honestly, "but not alone anymore." Something in his voice made her look up sharply. There was determination there, but also something more personal that made her heart beat faster. Judge Carter approached them, his weathered face set in stern lines. "Miss Reed," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "Lucas has explained your situation. I'd like to offer you the protection of my ranch until this matter is fully resolved." Florence hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. "This is my home, Judge Carter. If I leave, they win." The judge nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your father was a stubborn man, too." Admirable quality in a rancher. He glanced at Lucas. Perhaps another arrangement might suit better. Lucas is my best man, but I can spare him for a time. Would you object to him remaining here as your protector until we can deal with the Blackwater situation permanently? Florence felt a flush creep into her cheeks. A single woman living alone with a man would normally be scandalous, but frontier practicalities often overrode conventional proprieties. I would be grateful, she said carefully, but I wouldn't want to impose on Mr. Zimmerman. Lucas stepped forward. It's no imposition, Miss Reed. I volunteered when I spoke with the judge. Their eyes met, and Florence saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Concern certainly, duty perhaps, but also a warmth that suggested his motives weren't entirely professional. Then I accept your generous offer, she said softly. As the sheriff led the captive outlaws away, promising to send deputies to patrol the area, Florence found herself standing beside Lucas on her porch. The setting sun cast long shadows across her land, turning the modest ranch into a landscape of gold and amber. It's beautiful, Lucas said quietly, following her gaze across the valley. Yes, Florence replied. This is what my father saw when he chose this place: potential. A future. She turned to him, suddenly needing him to understand. That's why I can't leave, even with Blackwater threatening me. This isn't just land, it's everything he worked for. Lucas nodded slowly. I understand more than you might think. His eyes held hers. My father had a small farm in Ohio. Lost it during the war, he never recovered from that loss. The personal revelation surprised her. Lucas hadn't seemed the type to share his past easily. Is that why you came west? Partly, he acknowledged. Wanted open spaces, a fresh start. A smile touched his lips. Found both and more besides. As twilight deepened around them, Florence realized that for the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel entirely alone. The Blackwater Gang still threatened her land and her life. The future remained uncertain. But standing beside Lucas Zimmerman in the gathering dusk, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope, and perhaps the first stirrings of something more. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Reed Ranch. Florence woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of movement in her kitchen. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. She had grown accustomed to solitude before she remembered the events of the previous day and the presence of Lucas Zimmerman. She dressed quickly in her work clothes: a practical skirt, sturdy blouse, and boots. Her father had raised her to work alongside him, and she had continued the ranch chores alone after his death. Having help would be a novelty, but she was determined not to appear weak or helpless before her new protector. Lucas looked up as she entered the kitchen. He had already stoked the fire in the stove and prepared coffee. Hope you don't mind, he said, gesturing to the pot. Old army habit: first one up makes the coffee. I'm usually the first one up, Florence replied with a small smile, but I don't mind at all. She noticed he had rearranged some of the furniture overnight, positioning the kitchen table to provide a clear view of both the front door and the side window. Even at rest, he remained vigilant. I took a walk around your property at first light, Lucas said, pouring her a cup of coffee. You've got good pasture, Elland. Your father chose well. Florence nodded, pleased by his assessment. We run about 60 head of cattle in the North Valley. Not a large operation, but the quality is good. We've been selectively breeding for hardiness. Smart, Lucas commented. Wyoming winters demand tough stock. He hesitated. I didn't see any ranch hands. Have you been managing the herd entirely alone? Florence's pride warred briefly with honesty. After Pa died, I couldn't afford to keep our two hands on. Billy Jenkins helps when he can. His family has the adjacent property to the west, but he has his own ranch to run. Lucas's expression remained neutral, but she could see him mentally calculating the workload she had been shouldering. 60 head required constant attention, especially with calving season approaching. I'll need to check on the herd today, she continued, determined to maintain her normal routine despite the danger. They're due for salt, and I need to look in on a pregnant heifer that was showing signs of distress 2 days ago. I'll accompany you, Lucas said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. After yesterday's confrontation, Blackwater's remaining men will be watching for opportunities. Florence wanted to object to assert her independence, but practicality won out. Very well, we'll leave after breakfast. As they ate the simple meal of cornmeal mush and dried apple slices that Florence prepared, she found herself studying Lucas again. In daylight, the lean strength of him was more apparent. He ate with the efficiency of a man accustomed to taking meals when they were available, his eyes continuously scanning the windows and doorway. "Were you always this vigilant?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her reserve. Lucas paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "The army teaches you to stay alert or you don't come home." He set the spoon down. 7th Cavalry served in hostile territory. Let your guard down once, you might not get a second chance. Florence sensed the shadows behind his words. The ongoing conflicts with the Plains tribes had produced stories of brutality on both sides. "You saw combat then?" "More than I care to remember," he replied, his voice flat. Then, seemingly eager to change the subject, he added, "Your father, was he a cattleman before coming west?" Florence accepted the shift in conversation. "No, he worked as a bookkeeper in Philadelphia. My mother's death left him restless, searching for something new." She smiled at the memory. "He read about the Homestead Act in the newspaper and made his decision overnight." "I was 17 when we headed west." "Quite a change for a city girl," Lucas observed. "I adapted," Florence replied with a hint of pride. "The first winter nearly broke us, but we learned. Pa had a gift for understanding cattle, and I discovered I preferred open skies to city walls." They finished breakfast in companionable silence before preparing for the ride to check on the cattle. Florence was briefly embarrassed when Lucas discovered her using her father's saddle. She had been unable to afford a proper lady's saddle, but he made no comment beyond helping her adjust the stirrups. The morning air carried the crisp promise of approaching autumn as they rode toward the North Valley. Florence found herself relaxing slightly in Lucas's company. His presence was reassuring without being intrusive, and he asked knowledgeable questions about her ranching operations that showed genuine interest rather than condescension. They crested a small rise that offered a view of the valley where her cattle grazed. Florence immediately tensed, standing in her stirrups to get a better look. "Something's wrong," she said sharply. "The herd should be spread across that whole section, but they're bunched up at the far end." Lucas followed her gaze, his expression growing serious. "They've been driven," he said, pointing to dust still hanging in the air. "Recently, too." Without waiting for further discussion, Florence urged her horse forward. Lucas kept pace beside her, his hand moving to the rifle in his saddle holster. As they approached the herd, Florence could see the cattle were agitated, moving restlessly and lowing in distress. "Check for strays," Lucas said, his eyes scanning the tree line that bordered the valley. "I'll make sure we're alone." Florence did a quick count as she rode around the bunched cattle. Her stomach sank as the numbers failed to add up. "We're missing at least 15 head," she called to Lucas, who was examining tracks at the edge of the clearing. He nodded grimly. "Rustlers." 3 riders drove them north through that pass. He pointed to a narrow gap in the hills. "Tracks are fresh, couldn't be more than a couple hours old." Florence felt a cold anger replacing her initial shock. "Blackwater," she said, the name a curse on her lips. "He's stealing my cattle to punish me for refusing him." "Likely," Lucas agreed, returning to her side. "The missing cattle valuable stock, my best breeding bulls and some of the pregnant heifers," Florence confirmed, having identified which animals were gone. "They took the heart of my herd." Lucas's jaw tightened. "This isn't just theft, it's calculated to destroy your ranch's future." Florence fought against the despair threatening to overwhelm her. The loss of 15 prime cattle was devastating to a small operation like hers. Without the bulls, next year's calving would be minimal, and her carefully planned breeding program was in ruins. "We can track them," she said, determination replacing despair. "The pass narrows about 2 miles north. They'll have to slow down there." Lucas studied her face, clearly weighing options. "It's likely a trap," he said finally. "Blackwater would expect you to follow." "So we don't do what he expects," Florence replied, her mind racing. There's another route, an old game trail that parallels the pass but higher up. We could intercept them where the valleys meet at Cottonwood Creek. Lucas raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by her strategic thinking. Show me, he said simply. They rode hard, taking the steep trail Florence had mentioned. It was treacherous in places, narrow and rocky, but it allowed them to make good time while remaining hidden from anyone traveling the main pass below. Florence led the way, her determination lending her courage she hadn't known she possessed. After an hour's hard riding, they reached a vantage point overlooking Cottonwood Creek. Lucas motioned for Florence to stay back as he crept forward to scan the valley below. He returned moments later, his expression grim but resolved. 3 men with your cattle, moving slow. They've stopped to rest the animals. He checked his rifle methodically. This is our best chance, but it won't be easy. They're armed and they'll fight rather than surrender stolen cattle. Florence drew her father's revolver from her saddlebag. I'm not waiting here while you face them alone. Lucas looked as though he wanted to argue but seemed to recognize the futility. Stay behind me, he said instead, and if shooting starts, find cover immediately. Promise me that much. Florence nodded reluctantly. I promise, but those are my cattle and I intend to see them returned. They descended carefully, using the cottonwood trees for cover as they approached the rustlers' position. From their new vantage point, Florence could clearly see her cattle being held in a natural corral formed by the creek bend and a stand of trees. The 3 rustlers had dismounted, 2 keeping watch while the 3rd tended a small fire. You recognize them? Lucas whispered. Florence studied the men carefully. 2 of them ride with Blackwater's gang, the 3rd I don't know. Lucas nodded, formulating a plan. I'll circle around to cut off their escape route. When I fire a single shot, that's your signal to stay down. If anything goes wrong, ride back to the ranch as fast as you can. Be careful, Florence whispered, suddenly afraid for him. The realization that she cared for his safety beyond mere gratitude startled her. Lucas met her eyes, something unspoken passing between them. Then he was gone, moving silently through the underbrush with the stealth of his cavalry training. Florence waited, each minute stretching endlessly. She watched the rustlers, hatred burning in her chest at their casual theft of her livelihood. Her father had poured his heart and soul into building their herd, selecting each animal with care. These men had stolen not just cattle but her future. A single shot cracked through the air, followed immediately by Lucas's voice, clear and commanding. Drop your weapons, you're surrounded. The rustlers scrambled for cover, 2 drawing pistols while the 3rd grabbed a rifle from his saddle. Florence held her breath as Lucas fired again, the bullet splintering a tree trunk inches from one rustler's head. Next one won't miss, Lucas called out. Sheriff Blake knows you took these cattle. Surrender now, you'll face a judge. Resist, and you won't live to see sundown. For a moment, Florence thought his bluff might work. The rustlers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly rattled by the precision of Lucas's shooting and the mention of the sheriff. Then the moment shattered as one of the rustlers spotted movement Florence's horse shifting position behind the tree line. There's only 2 of them, he shouted. The woman and 1 man. Gunfire erupted as the rustlers opened fire on Lucas's position. Florence saw him duck behind a boulder as bullets chipped away at the stone. The cattle, panicked by the gunfire, began to break from their makeshift corral, scattering in all directions. Without thinking, Florence urged her horse forward, firing her revolver into the air. The unexpected movement from a new direction startled the rustlers, momentarily diverting their attention from Lucas. It was all the advantage he needed. Lucas emerged from cover, firing with deadly accuracy. 1 rustler fell immediately, clutching his shoulder. Another dove for safety, but wasn't quick enough to escape Lucas's next shot, which took him in the leg. The 3rd man, the one Florence hadn't recognized, turned his rifle toward her. Florence saw the barrel align with her chest and froze, suddenly certain she was about to die. The sound of the shot was deafening, but the bullet never reached her. Lucas had thrown himself into the rustler's line of fire, his own weapon discharging simultaneously. Both men fell, the rustler dropping like a stone while Lucas staggered, clutching his upper arm. Lucas. Florence cried out, dismounting and running to him, heedless of the danger. "I'm all right," he gasped, though blood was seeping between his fingers where he gripped his arm. "Just grazed me." Florence helped him to sit against a tree, quickly tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his wound. The rustler who had shot him lay motionless several yards away, while the other two were incapacitated by their injuries. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking as she tied off the makeshift bandage. "Why would you risk yourself like that?" Lucas's eyes met hers, intense despite the pain. "I made a promise," he said simply. "They'd have to go through me first." The words, the same ones he had spoken to the Blackwater Gang, held deeper meaning now. Florence found herself unable to look away from his gaze, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with danger. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching riders. Lucas struggled to his feet, positioning himself protectively in front of Florence despite his injury. Both relaxed when they recognized Sheriff Blake leading a group of deputies. "Looks like we missed the excitement," the sheriff commented, surveying the scene. "Judge Carter thought you might need backup when he heard about cattle missing from the North Valley." As the deputies took the wounded rustlers into custody, Florence helped Lucas back to his horse. Her cattle, though scattered, were all accounted for, and with the deputies' help, they would be able to drive them back to her ranch. "You saved my cattle," Florence said quietly as they prepared to head home, "and you may have saved my life." Lucas adjusted his bandage, wincing slightly. "Your quick thinking saved us both. That was brave, drawing their fire like that. Foolish, perhaps," she admitted. "But I couldn't watch them kill you." Something shifted in Lucas's expression, surprise, followed by a warmth that made Florence's cheeks flush. "Let's get your cattle home," he said, his voice gentler than she had yet heard it. "Then we can see about patching up this arm properly." As they rode back toward her ranch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the valley, Florence realized that in the space of 2 days, Lucas Zimmerman had become something more than a protector. What exactly that meant, she wasn't yet ready to define, but the subtle change in how her heart responded to his presence was impossible to ignore. The wound in Lucas's arm proved worse than he had initially let on. By the time they reached Florence's ranch, his face had grown pale, and the makeshift bandage was soaked through with blood. Sheriff Blake and his deputies had helped drive the recovered cattle back to Florence's north pasture, ensuring the herd was secure before departing with promises to increase patrols in the area. "Let me see that arm," Florence insisted as soon as they were alone, guiding Lucas to a chair in her kitchen. She worked quickly, cutting away his bloodied shirt sleeve to reveal a deep furrow where the bullet had torn through muscle. "Needs stitching," she said, her voice steady despite her concern. "I've done it before for my father and our ranch hands." Lucas nodded, his jaw tight against the pain. "Go ahead." Florence gathered her medical supplies needle, catgut thread, clean cloths, and a bottle of whiskey her father had kept for medicinal purposes. She worked methodically, cleaning the wound first with water heated on the stove, then with whiskey that made Lucas hiss through clenched teeth. "Sorry," she murmured, her fingers gentle despite the necessary pain she was inflicting. "I've had worse," Lucas replied, watching her work with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly. "In the war?" she asked, partly to distract him as she prepared to place the first stitch. He nodded. "Shiloh took a Confederate mini-ball through my thigh. Field hospital ran out of chloroform." His attempt at a reassuring smile twisted into a grimace as she pushed the needle through his skin. "This is definitely preferable." Florence concentrated on her task, trying to make each stitch small and neat to minimize scarring. The intimacy of the moment, her hands on his bare skin, his breath warm against her hair as she leaned close, created a tension neither acknowledged. "You're good at this," Lucas said quietly as she tied off the final stitch and began bandaging the wound. "Necessity teaches quickly," Florence replied. "Out here you learn to be your own doctor or you don't survive." When she had finished, Florence suddenly became conscious of their proximity and stepped back, busying herself with clearing away the bloodied cloths. Lucas remained seated, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said finally. Not just for this, for trusting me yesterday when I showed up out of nowhere. Florence paused in her tidying. You risked your life for me today, for my cattle. She met his eyes. Trust seems a small thing in comparison. Those cattle represent your future, Lucas said, understanding in his voice. I couldn't let Blackwater take that from you. Is that why Judge Carter sent you to check on neighboring ranches, to protect people like me from Blackwater? Lucas hesitated. Partly, but there's more to it. He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. The judge believes Blackwater is working for someone else, someone with money and influence who wants to consolidate land holdings in the territory. For the silver. Florence asked, remembering their earlier conversation about the vein her father had discovered. Silver, water rights, railroad access, all of it. Lucas's expression grew serious. Small ranchers like you are being squeezed out across the territory. Judge Carter's been fighting it because he believes in the small homesteaders' right to make a living. Florence absorbed this information, connecting it to rumors she'd heard in town about other ranchers facing similar pressures. And now Blackwater will be even more determined to take my land after what happened today. Yes, Lucas agreed, no false reassurance in his voice. Today was a setback for them, but they won't give up. The silver on your property is too valuable. Florence sank into a chair across from him, the weight of her situation suddenly overwhelming. I can't fight them forever, Lucas. I'm one woman with a small ranch and limited resources. Lucas reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture that felt both protective and comforting. You're not fighting alone anymore. The simple touch sent warmth spreading through Florence, momentarily distracting her from her fears. She looked up to find Lucas watching her, something unspoken in his eyes that made her breath catch. I should prepare supper, she said, reluctantly withdrawing her hand and standing. You need to eat to recover your strength. Lucas nodded, recognizing her retreat for what it was, not rejection, but a necessary step back from emotions neither was ready to confront. I'll help, he offered, starting to rise. You'll sit, Florence countered firmly. Doctor's orders, that arm needs rest. A smile touched his lips. Yes, madam. As Florence prepared a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and the last of her preserved peaches, she found her thoughts continually returning to the man seated at her table. 2 days ago, he had been a stranger. Now, she couldn't imagine facing the dangers ahead without him. What frightened her most was not the threat posed by the Blackwater Gang, but how quickly Lucas Zimmerman had begun to matter to her. She had sworn after her father's death that she would rely on no one, that independence would be her shield against further loss. Yet here she was, her heart opening to a man whose own future remained as uncertain as hers. They ate supper in comfortable silence, both too exhausted from the day's events for much conversation. Afterward, as Florence cleared the dishes, Lucas went outside to check the property one final time before nightfall. He returned looking troubled. There's movement in the hills to the west, he reported. Could be nothing deer or coyotes, but I don't like it. We should take precautions tonight. Florence nodded, trusting his instincts. What do you suggest? We take shifts keeping watch. I'll take the first one, wake you in 4 hours. Florence wanted to object his injury needed rest, but she recognized the practicality of his plan. All right, but I insist on taking the longer watch. You're wounded and need sleep to heal. Lucas looked as though he might argue but nodded instead. Compromise 3 hours each, and I take first watch despite your protests. Florence smiled despite her concern. You're a stubborn man, Lucas Zimmerman. Matched only by your own determination, Florence Reed, he returned, the use of her given name feeling intimate in the lamp-lit kitchen. As Florence prepared for bed, she was acutely aware of Lucas moving through the house, checking windows and doors, positioning himself in the front room where he could observe approaches from all directions. The knowledge that he was standing guard brought both comfort and a strange longing she wasn't ready to examine. She slept fitfully, dreams filled with gunshots and pursuing riders. When Lucas gently woke her for her watch, his hand warm on her shoulder, she started awake with a small cry. It's just me, he soothed, his voice low in the darkness. Everything's quiet outside, Florence nodded, collecting herself. I'll take over now, you should rest. Lucas hesitated, concern evident even in the dim light. Are you sure you're all right? You seem distressed in your sleep. Just dreams, Florence assured him, touched by his perceptiveness. Nothing unusual, given recent events, he nodded, understanding. Wake me immediately if you see or hear anything unusual, promise me. I promise, she said, touched by his concern. As Lucas retreated to the small second bedroom that had once been her father's, Florence took up her position by the front window. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the Wyoming sky. The beauty of it struck her anew, this land that had become home, that she was fighting so desperately to keep. Her watch passed uneventfully, the only sounds being the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant howl of coyotes. Yet Florence remained vigilant, her father's shotgun across her lap. The movement Lucas had spotted earlier worried her. Blackwater's men would not give up easily, especially now that 3 of their number had been captured. When dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Florence rose to prepare coffee. She was surprised when Lucas appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair tousled from sleep but his eyes alert. You didn't wake me for another shift, he said, a note of gentle reproof in his voice. You needed the rest, Florence replied simply. Your body is healing. Lucas accepted the cup of coffee she offered. I'm not much use to you if I'm too exhausted to shoot straight, he pointed out, though his tone suggested he appreciated her concern. One night of proper rest won't dull your skills, Florence countered. And I'm not entirely helpless, as I believe I demonstrated yesterday. A smile touched Lucas's lips. That you did. He sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim of the cup. You're a remarkable woman, Florence Reed. The compliment brought warmth to her cheeks. Necessity, not choice. This land demands strength from those who wish to claim it. Not everyone rises to that demand, Lucas observed. Many break instead. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders, coming fast. Lucas set down his cup and moved to the window, Florence close behind him. It's Judge Carter, he said, relief evident in his voice, and some of his men. They stepped onto the porch as the riders approached. Judge Carter led the group, his silver beard and commanding presence unmistakable even at a distance. Behind him rode 4 men Florence recognized as hands from the Carter ranch, all well armed. Lucas, Miss Reed, the judge greeted them as he dismounted. Glad to see you both well. Sheriff Blake told me about yesterday's excitement with the rustlers. 3 of Blackwater's men are in custody, Lucas confirmed, but we suspect others were watching the ranch last night. The judge nodded grimly. That's why I'm here. Blake received information that Blackwater himself is planning something significant. He's gathered his remaining men and was seen heading in this direction yesterday evening. Florence felt her stomach tighten with dread. Do you think they'll attack the ranch directly? It's possible, Judge Carter replied. Blackwater's desperate. The arrests yesterday have weakened his position, and his employers are demanding results. His employers? Florence asked sharply. You know who's backing him? The judge exchanged a look with Lucas. We have our suspicions. A mining consortium based in Denver has been buying land throughout the territory, using various intermediaries to hide their involvement. Blackwater's just their muscle, Lucas added. The brute force when legal methods fail. Judge Carter surveyed Florence's modest ranch with a critical eye. This property would be difficult to defend against a determined attack. Miss Reed, I must insist you consider relocating temporarily to my ranch until this matter is resolved. Florence straightened her spine, automatic refusal forming on her lips. Judge Carter, I appreciate your concern, but this is my home. I won't be driven from it by threats. The judge's weathered face showed both frustration and admiration. Your father was equally stubborn. It served him well as a rancher, though it sometimes made him a challenging neighbor. He sighed. If you won't leave, then we must prepare for the possibility of an attack. Blackwater has at least 8 men remaining in his gang. 9 against 7, Lucas calculated aloud. Better odds than I expected. Florence glanced at him, noting the casual way he included himself in their defensive force despite his injured arm. 8, she corrected firmly. I can shoot as well as most men. Judge Carter smiled slightly beneath his beard. Your father taught you well, I see. He turned to his men. Johnson, Cooper ride the perimeter. Check for any sign of Blackwater's men. Parker, help Miss Reed secure her livestock. Matthews will assess defensive positions. As the men dispersed to their assigned tasks, Florence found herself alone with Lucas for a moment. Your arm, she said quietly. How is it this morning? Sore, he admitted, but serviceable. Your stitching was expert if there's fighting. She began, concern evident in her voice. Lucas met her eyes steadily. I've fought with worse injuries, don't worry about me. Florence wanted to tell him that it was too late for that worry for him had already taken root in her heart alongside something deeper and more frightening. But the moment passed as Judge Carter returned to discuss defensive strategies. The morning passed in a flurry of activity. The judge's men helped Florence move her most valuable livestock to a protected pasture closer to the house. They fortified windows, created firing positions, and stockpiled ammunition at strategic points. By midday, the ranch had been transformed into a fortress of sorts. Florence had just finished preparing a meal for the men when Johnson and Cooper returned from their perimeter check, their expressions grim. Riders approaching from the south, Johnson reported. At least 8 men, moving slow but deliberate, Blackwater's leading them. Judge Carter nodded, unsurprised. How far out? Less than an hour, the pace they're setting, Cooper replied. They're not hiding their approach. They want us to know they're coming, Lucas said. Psychological tactic, or they're confident in their numbers, the judge countered. Either way, we prepare. He turned to Florence. Miss Reed, I know you're capable with a firearm, but I must ask you to consider your position carefully. If things go badly, having you in the crossfire, this is my home, Judge Carter, Florence interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. My father built it, and I intend to defend it. I won't hide while others risk their lives on my behalf. The judge studied her face for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. Very well, but you'll position yourself upstairs where you have cover and a clear view. Lucas, you'll stay with her. Lucas looked as though he wanted to object to being placed in a protective role, but a glance at Florence changed his mind. Understood, he agreed. As the men took their positions, Florence found herself climbing the stairs to her father's bedroom with Lucas following close behind. The room offered an excellent vantage point over the main approach to the ranch, with windows facing south and east. Your judge is clever, Florence observed as they entered the room. He's placed us in the safest position while making it seem like a strategic choice. Lucas smiled slightly. He's protective of those he respects, and he clearly respects you. Florence moved to the window. Looking out at the land, she loved the pastures where her cattle grazed, the creek that provided water even in the driest seasons, the distant hills where her father had discovered silver. All this, she said quietly, because of water and silver, men willing to kill for resources that should be shared. Lucas joined her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. It's always been that way out here. Land, water, gold, silver, they bring out both the best and worst in people. And which has it brought out in you? Florence asked, turning to study his profile. Lucas met her gaze, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. I've done things I'm not proud of, Florence. The war, after. There were times when survival meant compromise. Yet here you are, risking your life for a woman you barely know and a piece of land that isn't yours. Perhaps I'm trying to balance the scales, he said softly. Florence reached out impulsively, her hand finding his. Or perhaps you're simply a better man than you believe yourself to be. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Lucas's fingers tightened around hers, and Florence felt herself drawn toward him by a force as inevitable as gravity. The sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Lucas turned toward the window, his expression shifting instantly from vulnerable to vigilant. They're here, he said grimly. Florence joined him at the window, her heart pounding for entirely different reasons now. Through the glass, she could see riders approaching 8 men, just as Johnson had reported, led by a figure she recognized immediately as Wade Blackwater. Unlike the previous confrontation, all the men were heavily armed, rifles clearly visible. "They're not being subtle," Florence observed, her mouth dry with fear despite her determined words. "No," Lucas agreed. "They've abandoned pretense. This is a show of force." He checked his revolver methodically, then positioned the rifle Judge Carter had provided. "Stay back from the window." "We watch and wait for the judge's signal." Florence nodded, taking up her position with her father's shotgun. Below, she could hear Judge Carter's voice, though not his words, as he stepped onto the porch to face the approaching riders. The battle for her home, for her future, had begun, and the outcome remained terrifyingly uncertain. Judge Carter stood on Florence's porch, his stance relaxed but his hand resting near his holstered revolver. The riders approached slowly, stopping about 30 yards from the house. From her upstairs window, Florence could see Wade Blackwater, clearly now a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "That's far enough, Blackwater," Judge Carter called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Blackwater sat easily in his saddle, surveying the ranch with an owner's eye. "Carter," he acknowledged with a mocking tip of his hat, "didn't expect to find you playing nursemaid to a homesteader." "Miss Reed is under my protection," the judge replied evenly. "As is every law-abiding citizen in this territory." Blackwater laughed, the sound ugly and forced. "Law out here, we both know better, Carter. Law is what men with power decide it is." His gaze swept upward, and Florence instinctively pulled back from the window, though she knew he had already spotted her. The girl's father understood reality eventually. "Pity she's more stubborn." "3 of your men are in Sheriff Blake's custody," Judge Carter said, ignoring the taunt. "They'll hang for rustling and attempted kidnapping. I suggest you and your remaining men leave this territory while you still can." Blackwater's expression hardened. "My business is with Miss Reed, not you, Carter. This can end peacefully if she agrees to sell her land for a fair price." "There's nothing fair about forcing a woman from her home through threats and violence," the judge countered. Florence felt anger rise within her at being discussed as though she weren't present. Before Lucas could stop her, she leaned out the window. "I'm not selling, Blackwater." "Not today, not ever." Blackwater's eyes snapped to her, his scarred face twisting into something that might have been a smile on a different man. "There she is, the girl who thinks she can stand against progress," he gestured expansively. "Look around you, Miss Reed. This territory is changing. Small ranchers like you are a dying breed. The future belongs to operations with capital and scale." "My father built this ranch from nothing," Florence called back, ignoring Lucas's attempt to pull her away from the window. "I won't dishonor his memory by surrendering it to thieves." "Thieves." Blackwater's face darkened. "We've made you generous offers. It's not our fault you're too foolish to accept them." Judge Carter cut in before Florence could respond. "Enough talk, Blackwater. State your business plainly and be on your way. Miss Reed isn't interested in selling." Blackwater's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the ranch house, noting the armed men positioned at windows and behind makeshift barricades. "I see you've brought reinforcements, Carter. Planning for trouble?" "Just being cautious," the judge replied. "These are dangerous times for honest folks." A tense silence followed as Blackwater and his men exchanged glances. Florence could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge, violence imminent but not yet inevitable. "I have new terms to offer Miss Reed," Blackwater finally said, "not from me but from my employer." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. A final offer considerably more generous than previous ones. "Who is your employer?" Judge Carter demanded. "If they want to negotiate legitimately, why hide behind hired guns?" Blackwater ignored the question. "Miss Reed has until sundown to consider the offer. After that, we'll be forced to take more direct action." His eyes found Florence again. "Your uncle in Cheyenne is still an option, Miss Reed. Ransom might be messier, but it's effective." Lucas's hand closed around Florence's arm, gently but firmly pulling her away from the window. "Don't give him the satisfaction of seeing your fear," he murmured. Below, Judge Carter stood unmoved. "Leave the offer if you must, Blackwater. But understand this: any attempt to harm Miss Reed or seize this property will be met with deadly force." Blackwater stared at the judge for a long moment before tossing the envelope onto the ground. "Sundown," he repeated, wheeling his horse around. "I'll return for her answer then." The gang rode away, maintaining a deliberately unhurried pace that seemed calculated to demonstrate their lack of concern about the judge's threats. When they had disappeared from view, Florence released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He's not giving up," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "No," Lucas agreed, moving to the window to ensure the riders were truly departing. "But neither are we." They descended the stairs to join Judge Carter and his men in the kitchen. The judge had retrieved the envelope Blackwater had thrown down and placed it on the table, unopened. "Well, that was illuminating," he said as Florence and Lucas entered. "Blackwater's more desperate than I thought. His employers must be putting significant pressure on him." "He mentioned a final offer," Florence said, eyeing the envelope. "Should we look?" The judge nodded. "Knowledge is power, Miss Reed. Let's see what they consider generous." Florence opened the envelope with steady hands. Inside was a bank draft for a sum that made her gasp 10 times what her ranch was worth by any reasonable estimation, along with a typed letter on expensive stationery. "Western Consolidated Mining," she read aloud, scanning the letterhead. "I've never heard of them." "They're new," Judge Carter said grimly. "A consortium backed by Eastern investors and Denver mining interests. They've been buying up land throughout Wyoming and Montana territories." Florence continued reading, her expression darkening. "They're offering to let me stay on the ranch as a tenant if I sell them the mineral rights. They call it an accommodation to local concerns." "Generous indeed," Lucas said sarcastically. "You surrender your most valuable asset, but get to keep working the land until they decide to begin mining operations, of course." Florence set the letter down, her decision already made. "My father didn't build this ranch to see it stripped for silver and left barren." Judge Carter nodded, approval in his weathered features. "I expected nothing less from Joseph Reed's daughter." He turned to his men. "Blackwater will return at sundown and he won't be satisfied with a refusal. We need to prepare for a fight." The men dispersed to reinforce their positions, checking weapons and sight lines. Florence found herself alone with Lucas once more, the weight of impending violence heavy between them. "You could still reconsider," Lucas said quietly, though his tone suggested he knew her answer. "Take their money, start fresh somewhere else. No one would blame you." Florence shook her head. "My father died believing this land would sustain our family for generations. There are things more important than money, Lucas." "Like what?" he asked, something vulnerable in his question. "Home," she answered simply. "Belonging, standing for what's right even when it's difficult." She met his eyes directly. "Surely you understand that or you wouldn't be here." Lucas held her gaze, something shifting in his expression. "I understand it better now than I did before meeting you," he admitted softly. Florence felt her heart quicken at his words and the intensity behind them. But before she could respond, Judge Carter returned, breaking the moment. "We have a few hours until sundown," the judge said, oblivious to the current between them. "I suggest we use the time wisely. Florence, is there anything of value you'd like to secure in case we need to abandon the house?" The question jolted Florence back to the gravity of their situation. "My father's papers the deed to the ranch, his journals. They're in the bureau in my bedroom." "Go gather them," the judge advised, "and anything else irreplaceable. We hope for the best but prepare for all eventualities." As afternoon lengthened toward evening, the ranch took on the atmosphere of an army camp preparing for battle. Judge Carter's men positioned themselves strategically, creating fields of fire that would make any approach to the house costly for attackers. Lucas, despite his injured arm, worked tirelessly alongside them, his military experience evident in his suggestions for defensive positions. Florence moved through her home collecting precious items: her mother's locket, her father's Bible, the family daguerreotype taken before her mother's illness. Each object carried memories, pieces of the life she was fighting to preserve. She placed them in a small leather satchel along with the ranch deed and her father's most important papers. When she had finished, she found Lucas waiting for her in the hallway. "The judge wants us upstairs again when Blackwater returns," he explained. "Best vantage point and—" He hesitated. "And the safest position if things go badly," Florence finished for him, understanding the unspoken concern. "I'm not afraid, Lucas. You should be," he said frankly. "Blackwater is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous," Florence nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. "Fear doesn't help. My father taught me that. You acknowledge it, then set it aside and do what needs doing." Lucas studied her face, admiration clear in his eyes. "Your father raised a remarkable woman." Before Florence could respond, one of Judge Carter's men called from below, "Riders approaching from the south." Lucas checked his pocket watch. An hour before sundown, Blackwater's early. They hurried to their position in the upstairs bedroom. Through the window, Florence could see Blackwater's gang approaching, but something was different. Instead of 8 riders, she counted at least 15. "He's brought reinforcements," Lucas said grimly, lifting his rifle. "This won't be a negotiation." Florence felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Judge Carter and his men were outnumbered now. The odds shifted dangerously against them. "We should warn the judge." "He sees it," Lucas replied, nodding toward the yard where Judge Carter had emerged onto the porch, his stance noticeably tenser than during the earlier confrontation. Blackwater halted his enlarged company at the same distance as before. Even from upstairs, Florence could see the smug confidence in his posture. "I see you've met some friends along the way," Judge Carter called, his voice betraying none of the concern he must have felt at the altered odds. Blackwater gestured to the men flanking him. "Just some concerned businessmen with interests in the territory's development." He scanned the ranch house, his gaze settling on the window where Florence and Lucas watched. "Is Miss Reed prepared to be reasonable, or are we doing this the hard way?" Judge Carter stood firm. "Miss Reed's answer is no. This ranch isn't for sale, not to your employers, not to anyone." Blackwater shook his head in mock disappointment. "That's unfortunate. I was hoping to resolve this peacefully." He straightened in his saddle. "Last chance, Carter. Step aside and let us collect the girl." "No one needs to die today. Anyone who sets foot on this property with ill intent will be shot," the judge replied flatly. "That's your last warning, Blackwater." Florence held her breath, awaiting Blackwater's response. She could feel Lucas tensing beside her, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Blackwater raised his hand, and in a single coordinated movement, his men drew their weapons. Judge Carter shouted a warning to his outnumbered defenders just as the first shots rang out. The air filled with gunfire and shouted commands. Florence saw one of the judge's men fall, clutching his leg. Another of Blackwater's riders toppled from his horse as Judge Carter's revolver cracked. Lucas fired from the window beside her, his expression coldly focused as he worked the lever of his rifle with mechanical precision. "Stay down," Lucas ordered as bullets splintered the window frame. "They're trying to pin us down while some circle around back." Florence ducked beneath the window, her heart pounding. Through gaps in the boards, she could see Blackwater's men attempting to advance toward the house while others provided covering fire. Judge Carter and his remaining men held their positions, making each shot count against their more numerous attackers. A crash from downstairs confirmed Lucas's prediction someone had broken through the back door. Florence heard the thunder of boots on her kitchen floor, followed by the roar of a shotgun as one of the judge's men engaged the intruders. "We need to help them," Florence said, clutching her father's shotgun. Lucas hesitated, clearly torn between protecting her and assisting the defenders below. Before he could decide, the bedroom door burst open. Florence spun around to see one of Blackwater's men lunging toward her, a look of triumph on his face. "Got her," he shouted, reaching for Florence's arm. Lucas reacted instantly, driving the butt of his rifle into the man's stomach. The outlaw doubled over but managed to draw his pistol. Florence didn't hesitate. She raised her shotgun and fired. The blast caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him backward through the doorway. "More coming," Lucas warned, positioning himself in the doorway with his revolver drawn. "Stay behind me." Florence could hear fighting throughout the house, now furniture crashing, men shouting, the crack of gunfire. Through it all, Judge Carter's voice rang out, directing his men with the authority of someone accustomed to command. A second outlaw appeared at the top of the stairs, firing wildly. Lucas returned fire, his shot catching the man in the chest. As the outlaw fell, Lucas grabbed Florence's hand. "We need to move. This position is compromised." They hurried down the hallway toward the back stairs that led to the kitchen. Below, they could hear the continuing exchange of gunfire as Judge Carter's men fought to repel the invaders. "Where's Blackwater?" Florence asked as they paused at the top of the stairs, listening for movement below. "Don't know," Lucas replied grimly, "but he'll be looking for you. You're his leverage." They descended carefully, Lucas leading the way with his revolver ready. The kitchen was a scene of destruction, the table overturned as a barricade, windows shattered. Florence's carefully preserved jars of food smashed across the floor. One of Blackwater's men lay motionless near the back door, while one of Judge Carter's hands crouched behind the overturned table, blood seeping from a wound in his side. "Matthews," Lucas said, kneeling beside the wounded man. "How bad is it?" "I'll live," Matthews grunted. "But they're inside, at least 4 of them. Judge is holding the front room with Cooper and Johnson." Lucas nodded. "We need to rejoin them. Can you move?" Matthews struggled to his feet with Lucas's help. "I can still shoot," he affirmed, though his face was pale with pain. "Stay close," Lucas told Florence as they prepared to move through the house toward the front room where Judge Carter was making his stand. They had taken only a few steps when a voice stopped them cold. "That's far enough." Wade Blackwater stood in the doorway leading to the dining room, his revolver aimed directly at Florence's heart. Behind him, 2 more of his men blocked any escape route. "Miss Reed," Blackwater said, a cold smile spreading across his scarred face. "I believe it's time for you to come with me. Your uncle in Cheyenne is eager to discuss the future of this property." Lucas positioned himself slightly in front of Florence, his own weapon still raised. "She's not going anywhere with you, Blackwater." "The lady doesn't have a choice," Blackwater replied. "My men have your precious judge pinned down. He's got maybe 2 bullets left and his men are in worse shape." His cold eyes focused on Florence. "Come peacefully and I'll call my men off. Everyone lives. Refuse and we'll kill every man here, starting with your protector." Florence felt time slow around her. She could hear the continuing gunfire from the front of the house, the groans of wounded men, the heavy breathing of Matthews beside her. Lucas stood rock-steady in front of her, his injured arm seeming to cause him no hesitation as he faced Blackwater. "Florence, no," Lucas said softly, sensing her thoughts. "I can't be responsible for more bloodshed," she replied, her voice barely audible. Blackwater's smile widened. "Sensible girl, tell your man to drop his weapon and we'll end this unpleasantness." Florence stepped forward, her mind racing for a solution. Lucas remained where he was, his body a shield between her and Blackwater's gun. "If I go with you," Florence said, addressing Blackwater directly, "I want your word that these men will be allowed to leave unharmed." "Florence," Lucas protested, not lowering his weapon. "You have my word," Blackwater agreed smoothly. "My quarrel isn't with them, it's business, nothing more." Florence knew his word was worthless, but she needed time to think. "Lucas," she said quietly, "please." Lucas turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers. In that brief look, something passed between them, not surrender but understanding. Florence gave him the slightest of nods, hoping he would comprehend her meaning. "All right," Lucas said, slowly lowering his revolver. "No more bloodshed." Blackwater gestured to his men. "Take their weapons, then escort Miss Reed outside. Our horses are waiting." As one of Blackwater's men approached to disarm Lucas, Florence saw his muscles tense imperceptibly. She braced herself, knowing what would come next. The moment the outlaw reached for Lucas's revolver, chaos erupted. Lucas drove his elbow into the man's throat, simultaneously dropping to one knee as gunfire erupted from the doorway behind them. Judge Carter and Cooper had broken through from the front room, their timing perfect. Blackwater fired, his bullet passing through the space where Lucas had been standing a split second earlier. Lucas rolled, coming up with his revolver still in hand. His shot caught Blackwater in the shoulder, spinning the outlaw back against the wall. Florence, down. Lucas shouted as the room filled with gunfire. She dropped to the floor, crawling toward the relative protection of the overturned table. Matthews, despite his wound, had joined the fight, his revolver barking steadily at Blackwater's men. Through the chaos, Florence saw Blackwater regain his balance, his face contorted with pain and rage. He raised his gun again, aiming not at Lucas but at Judge Carter. Without thinking, Florence grabbed a cast iron pan from the floor beside her and hurled it with all her strength. The pan struck Blackwater's arm just as he fired, sending his shot wide. Before he could recover, Lucas's bullet found its mark. Blackwater staggered, a look of disbelief crossing his scarred face as he slumped to the floor. Seeing their leader fall, the remaining outlaws lost heart. Within minutes, the gunfire had ceased as Blackwater's men either surrendered or fled. Judge Carter, blood streaming from a graze along his temple but otherwise intact, directed Cooper and Johnson to secure the prisoners. Florence found herself standing in the ruins of her kitchen, surrounded by the aftermath of violence. Lucas appeared beside her, his expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Florence shook her head, feeling strangely calm despite the devastation around her. "No, you." "Nothing new," he replied, offering a tired smile. His injured arm was bleeding again, the bandage soaked through, but he seemed unconcerned by it. Judge Carter approached them, pressing a handkerchief to his bleeding temple. "It's over," he said simply. "Blackwater's dead. His men are either captured, fled, or in no condition to cause further trouble." Florence looked around at her damaged home, windows shattered, furniture destroyed, bloodstains on the floors her father had laid with his own hands. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," the judge replied, "we rebuild. And we make sure Blackwater's employers understand that Wyoming Territory isn't theirs for the taking." As the judge walked away to help with the wounded, Lucas remained at Florence's side. Without a word, he reached for her hand, his fingers twining with hers in a gesture that felt like both comfort and promise. Florence tightened her grip on his hand, anchoring herself in the present moment. Her home was damaged but standing. She was alive. And the man beside her, this quiet, steadfast cowboy who had appeared in her life just days ago, had become something she had never expected to find in the harsh reality of Wyoming Territory. Hope, strength, and perhaps, if she dared to believe it, the beginning of love. The following days passed in a blur of activity. The dead 4 of Blackwater's men and, thankfully, none of Judge Carter's were buried in a small plot behind Florence's barn. The wounded were tended, prisoners were transported to the county jail in Sheriff Blake's custody, and the slow process of repairing Florence's damaged home began. Judge Carter had insisted on leaving 2 of his men, Cooper and Johnson, to help with repairs and provide security. "Just until we're certain all danger has passed," he had explained before departing for his own ranch. Blackwater may be gone, but his employers remain a concern. Florence had gratefully accepted his offer, though her attention increasingly focused on Lucas Zimmerman. His wound had reopened during the fight, requiring fresh stitches and strict orders from Cooper, who had some medical experience, to rest his arm. Lucas had ignored these instructions, working alongside the others to repair windows, replace damaged furniture, and restore order to Florence's home. Only when she had firmly insisted did he finally agree to let his arm heal properly. "You're as stubborn as she is," Cooper had commented with a grin as Lucas reluctantly sat down while the others continued working. "Someone has to match her," Lucas had replied, his eyes following Florence as she directed the repairs with quiet competence. A week after the battle, Florence found Lucas sitting on her front porch in the early morning light, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. The ranch was quiet, Cooper and Johnson still sleeping after their night watch. "May I join you?" Florence asked, her own coffee cup in hand. Lucas smiled, moving over to make room on the bench. "It's your porch." Florence sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Beautiful morning," she observed, watching the sun's first rays gild the distant hills. Yes, Lucas agreed, though his eyes were on her rather than the landscape. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Florence was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body in the cool morning air. "Judge Carter sent a telegram," she said finally. "Sheriff Blake confirmed that the remaining members of Blackwater's gang have fled the territory." "Good news," Lucas replied, "though I suspect Western Consolidated Mining will find other methods to pursue their interests." Florence nodded. "The judge believes they'll try legal challenges now, questioning the validity of homestead claims, leveraging political connections." She set her coffee cup down. "But those are battles for another day." Lucas studied her profile, admiring the determined set of her jaw. "You won't give up the fight." "Never," she affirmed. Then, more softly, "My father believed in building something that would last, so do I." "What will you do now?" Lucas asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. Florence turned to face him directly. "Rebuild, strengthen my herd, file the mineral claim my father discovered." She hesitated, gathering courage. "What will you do, Lucas?" "Judge Carter will be expecting you back at his ranch soon." Lucas set his cup aside, his eyes never leaving hers. "That depends," he said quietly. "On what?" Florence asked, her heart suddenly racing. "On whether there might be a place for me here." His voice was steady but vulnerable in a way she hadn't heard before. Not just as protection against threats that might return, but as something more permanent. Florence felt warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the morning sun or hot coffee. "Are you offering to work for me, Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked, though she understood his meaning perfectly. A smile touched his lips. "I'm offering to build something lasting with you, Florence Reed, if you'll have me." Florence reached for his hand, her fingers entwining with his. "I've never been one for conventional courtship," she said, her voice soft but certain. "My mother would be scandalized by how quickly this has happened." "Nothing about our meeting was conventional," Lucas pointed out, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Some connections don't need time to prove themselves, they're tested in fire instead." "And we've certainly had our share of fire," Florence agreed. Lucas's free hand moved to cup her cheek, his touch gentle. "I came to your ranch expecting to help a neighbor in trouble. I never expected to find a woman who would change how I see my future." Florence leaned into his touch, her heart full. "When Blackwater and his men first came, I thought I would lose everything my father built. Instead, I found something he would have valued even more, someone to share it with." Lucas leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Florence met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that felt like both question and answer. His hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. When they finally parted, Florence kept her eyes closed for a moment, savoring the feeling. "I should warn you," she said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze, "I'm not an easy woman to court. I have opinions about how this ranch should be run, and I won't be relegated to kitchen duties simply because there's a man in the house." Lucas laughed softly, the sound warming her further. "I wouldn't dare try. I admire your strength, Florence. It's part of what draws me to you." "And what else draws you?" she asked, curiosity and newfound confidence emboldening her. "Your courage," he answered without hesitation. "Your determination, the way you faced armed men without flinching." His expression softened. "And the gentleness beneath that strength, how carefully you tended my wound, how deeply you care for this land and what it represents." Florence felt tears threatening at his words, more moved than she had expected to be. "I never thought I would find someone who understood," she admitted. "After my father died, I resigned myself to facing the world alone." "Not anymore," Lucas promised, raising her hand to his lips. "If you'll have me, you'll never face it alone again." As the sun rose fully over the Wyoming hills, painting Florence's ranch in golden light, she made her decision, though in truth, it had been made days ago when a stranger had placed himself between her and danger, declaring that they would have to go through him first. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll have you, Lucas Zimmerman, as partner, as husband, as whatever the future holds for us." His smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. He pulled her close again, sealing their agreement with another kiss that promised a lifetime of such moments to come. Cooper and Johnson found them still on the porch an hour later, sitting close together, making plans for a future neither had imagined just days before. The men exchanged knowing glances but said nothing, respecting the private joy that radiated from the couple. 2 months later, on a crisp autumn day with leaves turning gold and red on the cottonwoods along the creek, Florence Reed became Florence Zimmerman in a simple ceremony at Judge Carter's ranch. The judge himself officiated, his weathered face beaming with approval as he pronounced them husband and wife. "Your father would be proud," he told Florence afterward, his voice gruff with emotion. "He always wanted to see this ranch pass to the next generation, now it will." Florence, radiant in a new blue dress ordered specially from Cheyenne, glanced at Lucas standing tall and handsome in a black suit beside her. "Yes," she agreed, though perhaps not in the way he expected. Sheriff Blake approached them during the celebration, a telegram in hand. "Wedding present of sorts," he said, handing the paper to Lucas. "Western Consolidated Mining has officially withdrawn all claims against Reed Ranch properties. Seems they've found easier targets elsewhere." Lucas shared a triumphant look with Florence. "We won," he said simply. "This round," she corrected, ever practical, "there will be others. And we'll face them together," Lucas promised, his arm sliding around her waist. As winter descended on Wyoming Territory, bringing snow that blanketed the land in pristine white, Florence and Lucas Zimmerman settled into the rhythm of shared life. The ranch flourished under their combined care. Lucas's expertise, with cattle complementing Florence's detailed knowledge of the land. They filed the mineral claim Florence's father had discovered, but decided to leave the silver in the ground for now. "It's insurance for hard times," Lucas had suggested, "and a legacy for our children when the time comes." Florence had blushed at the mention of children, though the thought filled her with quiet joy. Their small house, fully repaired and expanded with Lucas's skilled hands, felt more like home than it ever had. They worked side by side during daylight hours and shared warmth beneath quilts when winter winds howled outside their windows. Spring arrived with new calves strengthening their herd and green grass covering the hills. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Florence rested her head on Lucas's shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his arm around her in what had become a familiar embrace. "The day we met," she replied, smiling at the memory despite its danger. "When Blackwater and his men came to take me and you rode in like something from a dime novel." Lucas chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear. "Not exactly how I planned to introduce myself to the neighbors." "I'm glad you did, though," Florence said softly. "Introduce yourself that way, I mean. So am I." Lucas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I hope our children hear a slightly less dramatic version of the story." Florence sat up slightly, meeting his eyes. "Children?" she repeated, a smile spreading across her face. Lucas's expression softened with understanding. "Are you?" Florence nodded, joy and nervousness mingling in her chest. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. By winter, there will be 3 of us in this house." Lucas's face transformed with wonder. He pulled her close, his kiss conveying everything words could not: joy, gratitude, love beyond measure. When they parted, his eyes glistened with emotion. "Your father's legacy continues," he said softly. "Our legacy now," Florence corrected, placing his hand over her still flat stomach. "Built on everything he valued: determination, hard work, and love for this land." As twilight deepened around them, Florence Reed Zimmerman looked out over the ranch that had nearly been taken from her. The land her father had claimed, that Blackwater had coveted, that she and Lucas now tended together, would pass to another generation. The circle would continue, roots growing deeper with each passing year. "I love you," Lucas said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "More than I ever thought possible." Florence turned to the man who had declared that Outlaws would have to go through him first to reach her, the man who had made good on that promise, and everyone since. "And I love you," she replied, the simple words carrying the weight of all they had endured together and all that lay ahead. Always. As stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, Florence and Lucas remained on their porch, wrapped in each other's arms, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the territory itself. The dangers they had faced together had forged a bond stronger than any silver vein hidden beneath their land, a bond that would endure through whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, unbreakable and true.